really nice to see you tonight. Thanks for coming out. I know there's a lot of big events happening in the city this evening, so it's lovely to see you for an intimate setting of the Capitalism Workshop with our special guest, Bronwyn. After launching almost a decade ago, the Silicon Valley-based transportation network corporations, Uber and Lyft, rapidly expanded their operations into cities around the world, including Toronto, disrupting taxi unions, degrading labor rights, and diminishing public transit ridership. While apps are cheered as disruptive innovations that will benefit all, Uber and other ride-hailing companies actually perpetuate capitalism's old problems, many of them at least. Uber is imagined as solving social problems by creating new employment opportunities that will lift people out of poverty and help the poorest achieve the dream of social mobility. Yet Uber's structure, like any corporation, is an expression of inequality. In 2018, Uber's former CEO Travis Kalanick was worth about 4.25 billion. And before he left the company, Uber drivers in Detroit were making on average $9 per hour. Currently, the new CEO of Uber takes an annual salary of about 6.4 million. And according to a new study from the Economic Policy Institute, the typical American Uber driver, after paying the ride-sharing company's commissions and fees, vehicle expenses, and modest health insurance package, still earns about $9 an hour in wages. Clearly, Uber-Capitalism is not ending class inequality, but continuing to drive it forward. Nevertheless, the drivers for these corporations are frequently depicted by the company's public relations and advertising materials as freewheeling individuals, independent contractors, and even mobile digital entrepreneurs. But in reality, we might see them as part of a new working class. They are essentially in a relationship of subordination to a company out of necessity, not simply because they love driving around for 14 hours a day. Over 800,000 workers drive for Uber in a year, but far from being a stable and sustainable career, Uber drivers have quite a high turnover, work an average of 3 months, and average only 17 hours per week, often as a supplement to low-paid gigs in other sectors. So this really isn't a sustainable full-time career. This is often one way of making money in addition to 3 or 4 other ways in the so-called gig economy. Although Uber presents its app as affording its users choice and the freedom to move, Uber drivers themselves have little to no control over the day-to-day labor process or movements. When the app is turned on, drivers are automatically managed by algorithms, subject to near permanent surveillance, and disciplined not by an overbearing manager all the time, but rather by a user rating system. Still, ride-sharing app companies continue to financially as well as symbolically expand as symbols of an uplifting sharing economy. But when probed, it is anything but. Fortunately, over the past few years, important research on and activism surrounding these app firms and their owners has highlighted what their public relations obscures: emerging labor politics and class struggle to contest this exploitative business model. While Uber-Capitalism was incubated in the United States of America, the global system's technological core and the center of so much disruption, ride-hailing corporations are emerging around the world, and workers from New York City to Jakarta are organizing to challenge their deleterious social effects. In this regard, we're very happy that Bronwyn Frey has joined us this evening to present some of her important ongoing research on the worker organizational strategies emerging within Indonesia's vast informal transportation sector, where ride-hailing apps are widespread, and precarity is long-standing and perhaps less exceptional than in the West, in the US or Canada. Bronwyn is a PhD student in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Toronto. Her broad interest in the relation between culture, labor, and new technology have led her to Indonesia's ride-hailing economy, and currently food delivery apps and workers in Berlin. More specifically, Bronwyn is interested in how the social and political contexts of urban settings determine the development of platform capitalism. She's a member of the University of Toronto's Ethnography Lab and the Berlin-based Urban Ethnography Lab at the George Simmel Center. So in tonight's session, Bronwyn will discuss how motorcycle taxi drivers in the city of Bandung are collectively responding to the precarious platform labor regime of Go-Jek, the major Indonesian ride-hailing firm. Although highly antagonistic toward each other, Indonesia's older style informal sector drivers and an emerging grassroots app-based driver association use similar organizational strategies to establish claims to their working lives and to challenge Go-Jek's precarious labor regime. So following Bronwyn's presentation, our guest discussant Herman Rosenfeld of the TTC Riders and Free Transit Toronto will then speak to how municipal struggles for bigger, better, and more democratic public transit might be one way of contesting Uber-Capitalism, while at the same time reflecting upon how Uber poses a threat to democratic and inclusive universal public transit for all. So Bronwyn's presentation will last about 35 minutes or so, and then Herman will discuss for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to get into a 30 to 45 minute interactive question and answer period, which is always a treat in the Capitalism Workshop because a lot of thoughtful dialogue ensues and we learn a lot together. So I think we're ready to go, so why don't we give a warm welcome to our guest Bronwyn.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the introduction. I've been coming to Capitalism Workshop events since the fall, and there have been so many excellent speakers, and I'm just really honored to be included in that roster. So my master's research was on Go-Jek, which, as Tanner mentioned, is a major ride-hailing app for motorcycle taxis in Indonesia. So I was in the city of Bandung, which is sort of in the politically central island of Java. It's not too far from Jakarta. So I was there for 2.5 months doing ethnographic research. Right, so the app launched in 2015. It was the first, and I think it still might be the only Indonesian startup to reach unicorn status, which is a value of $1 billion US. It's now worth at least $3 billion. It has 500,000 drivers across 50 different cities. And one of the reasons it's so successful is because motorcycles, traffic in Indonesian urban centers is notoriously awful. So motorcycle taxis are often the fastest vehicles on the road because they can weave in between all of the stalled cars. Also, Indonesian cities, apart from sort of like their main drags, have these sort of off-street urban neighborhoods called kampung that are really densely built, often sort of kind of like favelas in Brazil. They're just sort of informally constructed over time. So often the streets are very narrow, and then motorcycles are the only ones you can sort of deliver people to and from. So what brought me to this was my interest in technology and the social cultural effects of new technology. So I grew up in Kitchener, and from what I remember growing up, it was just sort of a deindustrialized urban center, didn't really have the greatest reputation, kind of falling apart. And sort of from the mid-2000s onward, the startup scene became really big there. So I remember coming back from Ireland in 2015, and suddenly Kitchener has like glass and granite facades everywhere. And Google was building their new office there. So you can sort of, so Kitchener's social cultural environment and also its reputation have changed. So you go from Vice writing this snarky article about Oktoberfest and lonely old men to Toronto Life talking about its artisanal toast bars. And also the timestamp on the Vice article says 2014, but I definitely remember reading this in my undergrad, and it's a snarkier, less politically correct version of it, so that would have been 2012 or earlier. So then when I came to do to my master's in anthropology and technology, my supervisor's research site is Indonesia. He told me about Go-Jek, this hot new Indonesian startup, and it seemed like a good fit. Right, so my methods, like I said, are ethnographic. So that involves participant observation and interviews. So participant observation is what one anthropologist, James Clifford, has called deep hanging out. And so it's kind of based on the idea that you can best understand the setting that you want to research by doing what your research participants are doing. And I kind of like this picture just because it conveys sort of the awkwardness of the endeavor sometimes. And yeah, so my participant observation, I went to the Go-Jek office. A few times I went to this HDBR base camp, which I'll explain in a bit, a few times. And I took Go-Jek pretty much every day. And during all of these interactions, whether it's like on the back of a motorbike or just talking to the drivers at the offices or the base camps, I'm just trying to sort of speak to them about their work experiences and their routines and their life histories. And then interviews. So I was doing semi-structured interviews, so I just had like a list of guiding questions. I didn't follow it like to the letter every time, but it did help me make sure that I got comparable data from different interviewees. So I did 7 of these semi-structured interviews with Bandung drivers, and then 2 in another city called Jakarta, where I did my language lessons. Yeah. Right, so the focus of my research was this tension between Go-Jek drivers, who are included in this sort of grassroots organization called HDBR, and ojek pangkalan, which are the older style informal sector motorcycle taxi drivers who have been around sort of since the late 80s, when it became sort of cheaper to buy motorcycles on credit. So this was really interesting because even before I got to Bandung, people were telling me about how in this city, the tension between Go-Jek drivers and ojek pangkalan was so intense that the Go-Jek drivers wouldn't even wear their like branded green jackets that you saw in sort of like the promotional thing, because it would attract ojek pangkalan attention, and they would be intimidated or beaten up, or they would have to hand over money or something like that. So I got there in 2017. The app had already been active for 2 years, so when I was in Jakarta and Jakarta, like I did see these green jacketed Go-Jek drivers sort of zipping around the streets. When I got to Bandung, I didn't see any of that, and I saw ojek pangkalan. So this was the base camp or the pangkalan in the kampung where I was living. So for some reason in Bandung, they were really hanging on and protecting their market share. So yeah, HDBR, which stands for Himpunan Driver Bandung Raya, or the Greater Bandung Driver Community, was formed in response to this ojek pangkalan intimidation. So drivers were feeling unsafe. The government and Go-Jek, the company, wasn't really doing anything about it. So drivers from Go-Jek and also the other 2 that were active. So Grab Bike from Malaysia and Uber Motor. They all sort of joined HDBR to sort of, give themselves this protection. And I realized about a month into my stay in Bandung that they were also organizing in base camps, like the ojek pangkalan. So this was one that was right near my guest house. And they were trying to get drivers to only accept orders from within their base camp area. So they're also sort of trying to set up these like micro territories. And so my research question became like, what is sort of like the deeper like social logic that's structuring this kind of like territoriality. So the broad problem that my research was about was platform labor, which Tanner already explained in a lot of detail, which is great. So it's kind of like a technological version of the gig economy, where people are sort of increasingly working short-term contracts and like one-off jobs. So that means like your income is less stable, your benefits are not really guaranteed. So the platforms are like third-party mediators. So they're just they position themselves as just like a place where service providers can find customers, except that they're not just the mediators, they also act like employers because they set how much the service providers can earn, and they control their access to work. They don't provide any employer responsibilities, like guaranteeing how many hours of work you'll get or whether you'll have minimum wage or anything like that. These are just some. That's Didi, which is like a ride-hailing app in China. That's Grab Bike from Malaysia, and I think the rest are pretty familiar. That's 99 Designs. How platform labor works with Go-Jek. So there's like Uber, there's like the GPS that will track drivers as they drive through the city and assign them customers depending on their location. So their performance is also measured by key performance indicators. which are sort of these like quantified metrics about how well they're doing. So this is a screenshot from one Go-Jek driver's sort of like his account. So his metrics, you can see that he's taken 8 out of 21 incoming orders, so that's not great. So his percentage is kind of low. So you can also get bonus points. So bonus points determine like the length of the ride and what kind of what kind of service you're providing, like whether it's Go Food, which is like Uber Eats, or Go Car or something. So he's on his way to earning bonus points, and his average customer rating is 4.9. So the app can use this to manage and discipline workers. So for example, there's the incentive of the bonuses, or if your rating falls below like 4.2 stars on average, then you get a warning or you're just automatically shut out of the app. So all of this just happens sort of like automatically based on these things that they're tracking, like ratings and incoming orders and so on. Sort of more existential concerns about this kind of quantification of life and labor, in that it can be sort of socially and mentally alienating. So Franco Berardi, for example, in The Soul at Work, he's concerned about how these sort of like numeric logics as ways of like making life and work valuable are sort of stripping away people's ability to imagine and desire different ways of being with each other. And so another sort of issue in my research is that platform labor isn't the same everywhere. So in one of the articles that was linked to for this, there's a piece by Nielsen and Rossiter about precarity and Fordism as exception, which basically means that, so like here in Canada, for example, it's fairly concerning the way that platforms like Uber are not really giving you much labor security, and they're not really paying you very well, and you're sort of like your labor rights are being stripped away. But in Indonesia and many other parts of the world, like a sort of a strong set of labor rights or a welfare state has never really been the norm. So people have been dealing with this kind of insecurity for a long time already. So for example, in Indonesia, any kind of effective unionizing was illegal until 1998. I mean, there were unions, but the only unions that were allowed were like under the control of the authoritarian regime. And the informal sector in Indonesia has been estimated to make up about 61 to 70% of the labor force. So the informal sector just being anything that falls outside of the purview of governments or corporations. So it's just sort of people one-to-one or in sort of like networks that aren't really like captured by taxes and regulations and stuff like that. One of the theories that I was using to think about how people sort of make their lives more secure in the informal sector is incrementalism. So Abdul Malik Simone uses this a lot in his book on Jakarta and the informal sector there. So it's basically, incrementalism is a good way of thinking about how people can work together to make small gains when governments and corporations are indifferent or hostile. So it can describe how people build these dense off-street urban neighborhoods, like the kampung in Indonesia that I was talking about, or favelas. People have no formal claim to the land, and they can be kicked off at any time, but nevertheless they sort of build communities. So your house might be start off as like a tarp, and then the next year you have like a wooden wall and like 2 plastic walls, and it just sort of like grows accretively until like these places have like their own plumbing systems. Right, so Simone isn't the only one to use the theory of incrementalism, but he does use it a lot in relation to Jakarta, so that's very relevant to my work. And he also contrasts this incrementalist approach, which is sort of like more social and like more face-to-face, to Berardi's concerns that I was talking about earlier about datification and quantification and the kind of alienation that brings. So those two ideas are sort of, so like incrementalism might be another way of being effective in the world that sort of is not captured by like numbers and information flows and finance capital. Right, so anthropology has documented a lot of instances of what could be called incrementalism. So the examples that I have here are the street vendors. So a lot of these are in the informal sector. So, you know, every few years the government might decide that they're just too chaotic and they're big problems. They'll just clear everybody out and destroy their parts. But they always sort of come back because they are so embedded in just like the local economy and the local society. So one of their incrementalist strategies, for example, might be mobilizing in voting blocks to sort of get some kind of like material or political support from election candidates. Another example is informal kinds of financial services. So one is arisan, which is like a rotating credit association. So it's like a social club where people sort of pitch in, and then every month one person gets the benefits, either by a system or by a draw. So that's sort of in the top right corner over there, left and right. And another one is simpan pinjam, which are unbanked savings and loan associations. So these can help when people, you know, need to have a wedding or a big ceremony, or if there's like a health crisis and someone needs to go to the hospital. Another is sort of the construction of informal housing. So this is a guy in a kampung here sort of building something. And then and there are also sort of like more criminal kinds of incrementalism. For example, preman, who are these political thugs, so they have connections in powerful places, and they can offer you protection or they will force you to accept protection, but they are also a way of sort of like getting things done outside of official channels. So here you have a preman and a police officer walking side by side in Jakarta. So ojek pangkalan use a number of these informal or incrementalist strategies. So like I said, they organize in groups called pangkalan that congregate in kampung. So the kampung is their territory, or major transport hubs like airports or bus terminals. And then, so they're always in the same place. Well, they're usually in the same place, and so passengers just sort of know where they would be, and they go and they haggle for a fare, and then they're taken off wherever they need to go. So in their heyday, they also controlled the majority of territory. So if you were an independent ojek driver, you would have a hard time finding customers because you would always be in somebody's territory, which would often be protected by preman if need be. And just because pangkalan are in the informal sector doesn't mean that they're not organized. So they have like chairmen and officers. They might organize arisan, or those like rotating credit associations, and also collect membership fees, which can go towards like financing members' health care, helping in case of accidents, sponsoring soccer games, and probably also these fees go towards preman protection, some of them. And HDBR uses a number of these strategies as well. So they were formed in July of 2016, like I said, in response to the ojek pangkalan intimidation. And when I was asking people why they were joining, everybody said, like across the board, one reason they gave was the sharing of work-related information, especially related to red zones and ojek pangkalan. I don't know if I said, but like these kampung were known as red zones because Go-Jek drivers couldn't go in them. So another reason that they gave was making friends and socializing, and another was social security. So for example, the support of sick drivers. Two different drivers mentioned to me how HDBR had recently raised funds for one of their members whose daughter needed an operation for a tumor above her eye. So when I was there in 2017, their Facebook group had about 2,600 members, and right now they have over 10K. I mean, who knows how many of those are active, but still. And so like ojek pangkalan, they organize with officers, they have membership fees, and they have these micro-territorial base camps. And they're not alone, or they're not the only one of their kind in Indonesia. So there's sort of a similar group called Pagoja in Jakarta. There is the Asosiasi Driver Online, which is active in multiple cities in Indonesia. There's an anarcho-syndicalist union of Uber drivers in Jakarta called Kuman, which means bacteria. And so there is, and they do have support from like one of like the really big unions. So I said there were no unions, but like they're kind of are. So this acronym references the Indonesian Aerospace and Metalworkers Union. So they have sort of like voiced their official support for online ojek like actions, basically. So like HDBR and groups like them are sort of drawing on this combination of incrementalist, older style informal sector tactics, like with relation to social security and stuff, as well as just sort of more formal political venues like unions and protests and stuff. So sorry, I didn't mention, but so like one of HDBR's biggest and kind of only sort of formal protests like that was in 2016. So there had been a fare reduction, as there is constantly. So the fare went from 2,500 rupiah per kilometer to 2,000 rupiah per kilometer. So that's like 17 to 13 US cents. And so they had a big protest. There was like a lot of news coverage. There was a lot of people who showed up, but as far as I could tell, that action wasn't successful, because when I was there, like the following summer, it was still at 2,000 rupiah per kilometer. So one of the interesting things I've found is the way that formality is being incorporated into incrementalist strategies. So what I mean by this is that Go-Jek's attempts to have greater control over their drivers' labor through like GPS tracking and smartphones and stuff like that are actually used by the drivers to improve their working conditions. So for example, now that ojek drivers are included in the formal economy by working for Go-Jek, that means they can make demands from the government and corporations on the basis of labor rights, which so far haven't been that successful, but this is like a new sort of platform for them. Also, so Go-Jek tracks drivers through GPS and signs some orders accordingly, but the drivers can install apps to like hack their GPS, so they show up in like busier areas and they get more or better orders. Also, because all drivers need smartphones as a way to sort of keep track of everybody, this means that a lot of the drivers have a good deal of technological savvy, so they can sort of like network through WhatsApp chat groups and Facebook and stuff. Another incrementalist strategy is resource sharing. So I noticed that a lot of times when someone came to pick me up in their car or their motorbike, the person who was driving did not match with the photo of the person in the online profile who was supposed to be picking me up. So people are either sharing one account between multiple people, or they're selling their account sort of like on the down low to somebody else who needs it. Because turnover, like for Uber, is also very high. And they recruit like hundreds of drivers every day. So when I would go to the office, there would just be like crowds outside. And like clearly nobody, like they can afford to keep recruiting all of these people, I guess, because like the turnover is so high. So another conclusion that I want to draw from this is thinking of asking us to reconsider what counts as effective resistance. So HDBR's protests and sort of these more formal channels haven't been successful so far, but they might. But it's not clear that there is sort of one kind of effective resistance. So as Audra Simpson argues in her ethnography about Mohawk life, just enduring or refusing to go away is a form of resistance in settler colonial states which have like historically tried to wipe out indigenous people. And it's not exactly the same in Indonesia, but these incrementalist strategies that drivers draw on help them to endure, and these strategies endure. Also, another way to think about what's effective in Nielsen and Rossiter's piece is how to cultivate sort of trans-border solidarity. And they argue that you can do this through a process of translation, by which they just mean like the need to constantly be in dialogue with different people in different kinds of struggles without assuming that there's a single best way to fight precarity. And they give the example of a Punjabi taxi driver strike in Melbourne in 2008. So that was 1,000 drivers for 22 hours just sort of taking over the streets, protesting for better working conditions after one driver was stabbed in a racist attack. And the police and the government said they had difficulty dealing with it because they were not an organized group in terms of hierarchy or representation. So that's not quite what HDBR is doing, because they are like quite structured, but it does just show the power of less formalized kinds of struggle. And if we're concerned about the stripping away of labor protections through platform labor here, and the majority of Indonesians have been dealing with this for a long time, maybe we can consider incrementalist strategies in addition to more formal strategies like policy change or unionization. So it might just be a reminder that we have like an innate sociality that we can draw on to create supportive networks with people who are really close to us, whether they like live down the hall or they work beside us at the next desk. Yeah, so that's it.
Thanks very much, Bronwyn. We're now going to have about an 8 to 10 minute discussion by Herman Rosenfeld of TTC Riders and various other local municipal campaigns regarding public transit. To speak about the implications of the Uberization of the economy for public transit, and also to think through how struggles for better public transit can fight the Uberization of the economy. So let's give a warm welcome to
My experience, I have very little experience. I've taken an Uber once, and I'm not that. I'm more experienced in the more formal struggles and stuff. But the key thing for people in the public transit around Uber is sort of the danger that it presents to privatizing and individualizing what's now mass public transit. Although there is obviously in the margins of public transit, there's a need for kind of flexibility, which Uber and Lyft and those kinds of organizations promise to address in some way. And the public transit authority here at TTC and in other big cities has mixed experiences in actually addressing those, but they're still there. I spent some time in Cape Town, and they have the public transit isn't great, but they have these jitney they're vans, and they're privately run, and that's what you take. And but here the question is that I want to go for two pieces. One is about Uber around where Uber is trying to make inroads in Toronto and has made inroads in a number of places, but and how might that be addressed, and just a little bit about what's going on with the uploading. You probably heard about some of that stuff too, but is that Uber seeks to insinuate itself in some of these interstices of the transit system, which are problems. And one is where public transit doesn't reach or cover adequately certain areas because they're just not building. And you might have heard of this experiment called Uber Hop, which was like an Uber-run van that stopped around Liberty Village, in which people were trying to get to work and they couldn't. And it didn't quite work out, but it mostly served upper middle class clientele, charged more than TTC rates. And the jury's still out about how people who live in that area are going to be served to be able to get to work. Secondly, as a possible replacement for lower density bus services in outer spaces of inner suburbs. Here I'm thinking of like the wilds of the outer parts of Scarborough and Rexdale and those kinds of places. But There was a push by one of the most odious right-wing city councilors, a man named Denzil Minnan Wong. I don't know if you've ever heard of this fellow. He is one of the strongest right-wing privatizers and that sort of thing, and tax cutters. And he proposed that in fact an Uber-type van system would replace buses in the outer suburbs in some way, and that didn't really go anywhere. However, there's still an issue because the bus service, which is what serves most of the neighborhoods of working class Toronto, is not adequately funded. The third is providing spaces where you go to a bus stop, and how do you get to the bus stop from your more intensive high-rise area? And I'm not talking about downtown and overlooking the lake. I'm talking about some of the places in Rexdale, in Scarborough, and other places where increasingly the working class people live. When they drop them off at bus stops, how do they get to their home afterwards? This is called the first mile and the last mile. That's sort of and in a lot of cities, those are issues. And Uber has looked to try and fill those spaces. And they use the same kind of rhetorical narrative they use, providing flexibility and convenience that internet-driven ride-hailing can bring, along with this entrepreneurial glitz geared towards those who are tired of a kind of bureaucratic inflexibility that happens in these big organizations. And so there are a number of problems. Just wanted to look at it. Uber is a private enterprise, and one of the meta-narratives is to undermine public transit and start working towards privately owned transit systems. And in some small towns, you might have heard of Innisfil, which is on the way to Barrie. You want to go skiing up that way, you go through Innisfil. Innisfil, I think, has transit systems run by Uber because they don't have the resources to have. And there are a number of places in the U.S., where a number of cities in the U.S., Atlanta, I think a number of others, where they have the public transit system works jointly with an Uber-type organization. But it's a private enterprise, and it acts as a threat to public transport. Second, it's a model of individual ridership for the most part. And as the major auto companies are starting to move towards a model in the future of having semi-autonomous or autonomous vehicles that they own, that you don't buy, that you simply call, that you have access to it. If you think about what that would look like, it sort of looks like where you have access to more and more private cars on the road, even if they're not driven by anybody, even if they don't wear out like as many as the others. But from an environmental perspective, it's not very positive in the sense of what goes into building these things, and it's not mass transit in the sense that, yes, there's always going to be a contradiction between our individual choice of where we want to go and what a mass transit would be involved, and that's always going to be there. The question is, do you go so far to that one side that everything becomes individualistic? That's really where that model is. It's sort of like taking now, where everybody gets the opportunity, if you have the money to buy a car and drive it, that you don't necessarily have the opportunity to buy and drive it, but you're still driving individually. And that's not necessary if we want to move towards a sustainable future. This is really not the model we want to go. And proliferating the individual users model wouldn't address other issues of climate change and pollution, including road congestion, just as the just-in-time delivery of things from Amazon also doesn't help road congestion. And we want to move away from a situation where our streets are basically places for cars and road congestion. They're places we want to be able to walk, ride our bikes, and that sort of thing. So mass public transit could easily address some of these problems. There's no reason that the TTC couldn't amass a fleet of vans, or even better, electrically or other alternative powered small bus-like vehicles geared towards providing the first Ks of public transit to and from bus and other stops, along with actually providing adequate buses. That can happen. It can be done publicly. And some of the advantages of that Uber and Lyft use in terms of using the internet or being more flexible where people are available, that can happen. It's not going to be as individualistic, but it can certainly happen. And that's what, I guess, what the functional equivalent of those vans in Cape Town would be, except they would be run publicly. And there's no reason why they couldn't. And the people driving them would be unionized. Now, who knows what happens if Uber gets their foot in to do this? Obviously, you want to be able to organize them. And even though the cultures are different, unofficial and informal resistance forms tend to be rather universalistic in some of the things that they do. So a lot of the lessons that you've described, which are familiar to other places when you learn about how people organize, like that people organize before they can actually have industrial unions in the West. They used a lot of those principles, and they're not to be looked down upon. In fact, they're the essence of what collective resistance happens to have. So the other point is that they have this grid principle in Toronto, which is one of the positive things about the TTC and transit, in the sense that you have larger geographical areas, but do have a certain amount of density. You have buses, and then you have buses taking you to areas where there's more frequent transportation, either more frequent transit, or to subways or to streetcars, and increasingly also to subways, because one of the outcomes of this period, whether they're uploaded or not, is that there will probably be more subways built. And that's negative in some ways, but positive in other ways. It's going to be one of the outcomes of having this government. So that's how I would say about Uber. The other thing is about that there's a campaign going on against the uploading attempt of they have the power. The provincial government is saying that they're either going to take over the ownership of the subways, or they're going to take over ownership of all the new subway projects, or thirdly, some combination. The first one is what they're looking at, and they're being coy about what they actually have planned, and it may not be till June or so will they actually say what they're going to do. But there's a movement against it, and the reason why there's a movement against it is because it provides potentially a big step backwards. Not to mention that the TTC, in one of its positive senses, is integrated. In the sense, I talked about the grid system basically, but all of public transit is planned in a way that the faster components are supposed to operate in conjunction with the slower components, and also newer kinds of components like LRTs, which are going to be coming in. If the province owns the subway system, they can do things which right now are taboo, but they would actually break whatever universality public transit has. One is fare by distance. Some cities have that, where if you lived by Port Union Road, way out by in the East End, that you'd have to pay extra to get downtown or get to the West End or see your Uncle Charlie on the other side of town. And people of low incomes who rely a lot on public transit for everything, going shopping, taking their kids places, recreation, social interaction, they would be most hit by this. The second is what they call payment by speed. So what that might be, in some cities they have where the faster forms of public transit charge more than buses and that sort of stuff. So what you would have is sort of like this priority lanes on the highways, where if you pay more, you go faster. And that means you segregate out people who work often, or people of low income, working people of low income, which are often people of color, women, in particular parts of the city. So buses become not a very important part of transit. They become the detritus of transit, and you get an increased stratification. More private is they can sell off part of the subway system. It sounds like it's crazy, but if you've ever been to England, or I've been to Scotland a few times, and you have to stop when you're on a bus at certain places because it's a different company that runs it, that runs the bus. If you do it with a subway, it could be very problematic, and it would mean often that certain routes that are more that bring in more revenue would be privileged. And that would be a particularly awful thing. Right now, what they're talking about is increasing subway building, which is not a problem, but funding it by having at every station a business, a developer or a business building something, and you'd sell it to you, you'd get a certain percentage back. But in order to be able to pay for it, they'd have to like build like the most huge building, expensive boutiques, land rights for wealthy people, so more condos for wealthy people to live. And it still wouldn't bring in that much money. There are some transit systems like Hong Kong. You might have read that there was an article around in one of the popular magazines that's what they do in Hong Kong. But all of the land is owned by this is owned by the government, and the transit system gets all the land cheap to be able to do this. This can't happen. The other thing is that the provincial government of the Tories is really into keeping car domination where we want to be able to whittle that away. So that's why they want to build subways everywhere. And sometimes subways are great, they're fast, they're very important. But if you don't have the needed density, it's not only a waste of resources, but it also means that the routes that they build are going to be the routes that people in the outer suburbs want to have. Part of the problem is that everybody, can you just tell me if you've had lousy experiences on the TTC? Getting there at 9 o'clock, trying to get it there in the morning, and there's a big crowd, you say, oh shit. Then you finally get on, you can't move, and suddenly it stops because you can't hear, and they announce it, and you can't even hear what they're saying, and anyway, the appeal toward, part of the reason is that the TTC is starved of funds and doesn't spend money, doesn't have enough money to be able to address the operations and the maintenance. And that's because the province and the city don't raise enough taxes and don't give it the money. And the argument is that people hear, well, if the province is going to take it over, they'll have the money to do it. Well, guess what? They have the money now, and they just don't want to do it because they'd rather not spend it on other things, or they're into austerity and tax reduction mode. So a lot of people think that uploading the subway will be a positive thing because anything to address this, and Ford says, well, we can borrow money cheaper, so it's easy to do. Hey, if you can borrow money cheaper, why don't you help borrow it now? Why haven't you done it for the last 20 years? The fact is that could happen. So this is what a campaign is going on, and there's materials here. We're doing what the transit movement has done, along with the union movement in Toronto, very positively. They've hired an organizer, and the transit workers union, that's the people who actually work in the subways and in all the transit. There's an amalgamated transit workers union, local 113. They have this Keep It Public campaign, but they hired an organizer, and the international component of that union also hired two young organizers. One is a grad of York, who's a friend of ours in the Socialist Project, and they're working to try and also to challenge this. And what the main thing they're trying to do is to educate people about what it really means to upload the subway. And because a lot of people think this, like I said, it's a good thing because it seems instinctive. Province has more money, it's lousy, maybe they'll run it better and that sort of thing. And maybe they'll build more. But one of the reasons why they haven't built that much is because scum like Ford, his brother, and their allies were in charge. They were there. They weren't the dominant, before Ford got elected, they weren't the dominant force in city politics. But they were there, and they always voted against anything that they didn't like. So anyway, this is the kind of thing that we're doing. And one of the things they're concentrating on, and it's interesting, is to canvass at transit hubs and hand out stuff and to talk to people, but also to knock on people's doors and to go into neighborhoods and areas that voted for conservatives. So they might be people whose minds they can change, and to get them to complain to their conservative representatives. Now, I have no illusions about that, but the Ford administration has already been. They respond not in a direct way, but in an indirect way to public pressure if public pressure is enough. remember the announcement that they were going to use the greenfield and build there. A lot of the building and development industry believes this bullshit. That's the reason why housing prices are so high, is because they can't build in the greenfields. And they backed off to a certain about then. They backed off also on the sex ed thing, even though that they didn't back off enough. Hopefully we'll be able to force them over around this. So anyway, there's materials here in case you're interested. That's it. And
Thank you.
It's really nothing like it.
I think it's